Hello everyone, welcome back to Rho Sigma Tutoring. In this video we're going to be covering orientation and organization of neuroanatomy. So let's get into it. So orientation, so let's just draw like a side view of the brain here. So a side profile, if you will. And I don't claim to be any sort of artist, and then we'll say that is the brainstem, and then let's say it ends right about there. So then we have the temporal lobe right around there, and then this would be your cerebellum, and then that's your cerebellum, and then here's your brainstem, and then right around here is your spinal cord. This is where the spinal cord starts. So just to get us sort of involved with what kind of divisions we can split the brain into. So here's a brain model. So this is a side profile. If we decided to flip it and kind of look at it like this, and we cut it straight down the middle, what kind of cut would that be? So in this model, you can actually split it right down. And that would, of course, would be a sagittal cut, and then where it's specifically right in the middle, that would be a mid-sagittal cut. And then if you look, in the brain, there's a whole bunch of anatomy that we could talk about, and we will go into. Just not so much in this video, just because we're trying to keep it light in this first one. So that's the first cut, a sagittal and specifically a mid-sagittal view there. And that one's going to be very common. Instead, let's decide to cut it like this. If we're talking about this kind of cut, then it would be a frontal or coronal section. And this model doesn't look like, doesn't look like it has one. However, the third kind of cut that we could look at is a transverse. So if we cut it directly in half like this, and this model actually has that. So if we cut it in half, and looky there, we have a transverse cut, and that would be right above the temporal right there. And then we could look at it like that, or like this. Okay, so those are the cuts. So now let's talk about directions, because I don't know about you guys, but this started off really confusing. But if you break it down, it's really not too bad. So let's say that we are right here. Okay? If we go beyond this point, going this way, what would that be called? So there's really two main words you could say. You could say I'm going anterior, because this would be the anterior surface. Or you could say I'm going rostrally. And where that kind of comes from, I like to say it's kind of like a rooster, because roosters have a beak, and you're going towards the beak, or you're going rostrally. So that's the rooster's beak. So what if we do the opposite? If we go backwards, then that would be going posteriorly. Okay? Or caudally. So caudally. Okay, that makes sense. That's not too bad. And then if I go above this point, you can't really go above it. Well, no, you could, because then you'd be in the meninges. We'll talk about that later. If you go up, you would be going superiorly. And then if you go down, that would be going inferiorly. Okay, so, that kind of makes sense. So now let's talk about the spinal cord. So let's say I'm right here. If I go up, you would say, oh, that's superiorly, and you would be correct. And then if you go this way, you'd say, oh, that's anteriorly, and you'd be correct. But which one of these directions would be rostrally? That's a trickier one. And it's actually going to be the superior one. So the superior one is also known as rostrally, because you got to think, throughout most of our evolutionary history, we've been on all fours. So the spinal cord is going to enter into the foramen magnum, and then the brain is going to be roughly here. And then, you know, there's the spinal cord. And then there's the rest of the brain. So going anterior is also rostrally, but going superior in the spinal cord is also. So a little confusing. Just know that superiorly is also rostrally. And then, of course, the other ones, that would be caudally, and then this would be posteriorly. All in all, shouldn't be too horribly bad. You just have to go look at it. Okay, so now let's go into something else. And that is going to be organization. So you can break down the nervous system. So the nervous system into two main categories. You're either going to be, if you're in the nervous system, you're either going to be in the central nervous system, or the peripheral nervous system. Okay, that makes sense. So what kinds of things are in the central nervous system? Well, you have the brain, and then you have the spinal cord. That makes sense. Something I do want to go ahead and talk about is that the spinal cord, we always like to think like, oh, the spinal cord is what's traveling through the vertebra. And for the most part, that's true, but the spinal cord ends at around T12L1-ish. It ends around there, which is why your lumbar punctures go at around that level. So the things that run through the central canal from there are different. That is the cauda equina, but we'll talk about that later. Something I should also say, the central nervous system does not include your spinal nerves and your cranial nerves. And the cranial nerves is what people really get confused about. It's like, oh, well, if it's in the brain, the cranial nerves, it's in the central nervous system. It is not. They are peripheral. So let's talk about the peripheral nervous system. You also have two main divisions of the peripheral nervous system. You have the somatic branch, and then you have the autonomic. The autonomic, what I want you to think about is automatic. So these things happen not because we're controlling them. And then somatic is the opposite. And this is like when we get touched, we feel it. And then when we want to actively move our muscles, this is how we do it. And that actually perfectly describes the two subsets of these. You have sensory. So this would be, my arm gets touched, and then that message gets sent to my brain, and then I feel it. And then you have motor. And that's, I want to move my arm, so then I move it. So that would be the motor. What a lot of people will get bent out of shape here is there's a lot of different words we could use to describe these. So I'm going to call out a couple more for each. So another name for sensory is ascending. And then another name for it is afferent. So regardless of what you see, if it's sensory, ascending, or afferent, that all means sensory, or it's getting sent to the brain. And then motor, they could call it motor, they could call it descending, or efferent. Okay. However, I think sensory and motor are probably the easiest ones to kind of get along with. So yeah, and then the autonomic. So these are the things that we don't have to think about, but it still happens. So think about things like breathing, your heart rate, your smooth muscles in your GI tract, all of that good stuff. So we have the sympathetic nervous system, and these are branches of the autonomic, and then we have the parasympathetic. Okay, so what do we need to know about these? How are these guys different? So I like to use the mnemonic. Sympathetic is fight or flight, so fight or flight. And then parasympathetic is rest and digest. Okay, so what does that mean? So sympathetic, that's going to be the nervous system that is active whenever we are stressed, when we need to like run away from something, you know. So that's the classic acronym is fight or flight. So if somebody jumps you on the street, you're either gonna want to fight them or you're gonna want to run away. And then parasympathetic is rest and digest. So that's going to be when you're more chilled out, when you're mellow. And because you're chilled out and you're mellow and you don't have to actively fight off anything, then your body rests, and then whatever food it has in its in your system, it tries to digest that. That way you get the most caloric, you get the most out of that meal that you're digesting. So that's the general organization there. And then one last thing I want to cover in this one, and just in case you zoned out, reel it back in. So, and this is the difference between gray matter and then white matter. So the first thing that I want to call out, because this is probably the most important part, is what makes white matter white and then what makes gray matter gray. I think it's easier to remember why white is white, and that is because myelin. Okay, so what does myelin do, Nick? So myelin is what surrounds the nerve cells, certain nerves, not nerves, the axon, and it speeds up the conduction of that electrical impulse. So just a little bit of review. So I'll draw a little axon here. And then we'll draw a couple little axon terminals. Not bad. I like that. Okay, so this is the axon. And then the myelin are these almost like pull buoy looking things. So the myelin, and then they have little gaps in between called nodes of Ranvier. And then, so what you really need to consider here is that these are made up of a lot of fat. And when you look at fat under most kinds of imaging, especially T1 MRI, you don't have to worry about that for right now. But when you look at it, it looks white. And you can almost like think of a steak. When you look at the fat on a steak, it's more almost like see-through, like more of a whitish tint compared to the rest of the meat. So it's white, and that's because of the fat that myelin that is in myelin. Okay, so why is gray here? Well, what you'll notice is that I didn't draw any myelin where the neuronal cell bodies are. So where you have a lot of neuronal cell bodies, so neuronal cell bodies, that is going to be the gray matter. And the gray matter is where the messages are kind of pondered about. So where there's a lot of neuronal cell bodies, that's where a lot of processing is going on. And then the myelin, that is the axons. So we'll put that in big, and that's where the nerves from the neuronal cell body, that's where they run. So another way you can think about it is if the axon is the interstate, then the cell bodies are the towns. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about tracks in a later video. Yeah, I feel like that about covers this one. There's a lot more things that we could talk about, but as of right now, for just this video, there's a lot of things that you guys, feel free to watch this a couple times and, really get it under your belt, because this stuff is the basics, and we'll cover more. All right, I'll see you in the next one.